Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters of the trade union movement, and friends from civil society. It is a great honor for me to be here today and to be the opening speaker in this very important semi-plenary session on child labour in agriculture. Thanks to Mr. Onya for his introduction, and I do look forward to a lively panel under his direction. He's already warned us that we should keep our remarks nice and short and leave as much time as possible for discussion, so I'll try to do that. Let me just see if the technology is with me. Okay, thank you. You have to show me again what you did.
Yeah,
that one. Okay. First, let me say a few words about my organisation, the IUF, UITA in Spanish and French and Portuguese. The IUF is a global trade union federation bringing together workers throughout the food chain, workers employed in agriculture and plantations, in the preparation and manufacture of foods, and in the restaurant, catering and hotel sector, and in all stages of tobacco processing. We currently have 388 affiliated trade union organizations in 124 countries, including, of course, several significant unions here in Brazil. The IUF works on eliminating child labor in agriculture in all of those sectors where we represent workers. In agriculture, of course, but also in hotels and tourism, where, for instance, we have an agreement with the World Tourism Organization to work together to combat child sex tourism, one of the things we heard described this morning as one of the absolute worst forms of child labor that we must work on. And increasingly, we're working on the issue of child domestic work through our cooperation with the International Domestic Workers Network. I know we have a semi-plenary session going on just along the corridor at the same time as our session, and I do look forward to hearing the reports from their discussions, as I think there are clear links between the two sectors. We know that many poor rural families send their children to work as domestic work, and that often children of farm workers are expected to help out in the landowner's house. Rural poverty and feudal attitudes are common to both sectors. I think I should start off by putting my cards clearly on the table and saying that the IUF's view as a trade union, that in the IUF's view, our most significant contribution to the elimination of child labour is by winning decent work and living wages for parents so that they do not need to send their children out to work to supplement the family income. That's our primary goal. And I welcome the comments that we heard from the ILO Director General this morning that child labour undermines our ability as trade unions to negotiate decent wages. As the first speaker in the panel, I've been asked to give some context and to talk a little bit about the extent and nature of child labour, both in family and non-family businesses. But before I do, I think it's important to share some other characteristics of the agricultural sector with you. I have to put on record that regrettably, agriculture is often characterized by significant decent work deficits. Agricultural workers are often denied even the basic rights covered in the ILO core conventions, in particular freedom of association and the right to bargain collectively. This is not just my view as a trade unionist, but I want to quote briefly from a report from the ILO from the 2008 Labour Conference on promotion of rural employment for poverty reduction. It stated, globally, rural workers still form the largest workforce. While improvements have been made in the protection of agricultural workers in some countries, in many others they are not covered by labour legislation and other regulations protecting workers. Furthermore, where laws do exist, lack of resources and political will to enforce the provisions, as well as isolation, poor literacy, poverty, and lack of organisation often prevent workers from fully asserting their rights. The labour protection gap for these workers remains huge. It's against this background that we have to consider the position of children working in agriculture. I think some of the other characteristics of the sector is highly dependent on migrant workers, and I'll come back to that in a little while, and there's increasingly precarious conditions around seasonal work and outsourcing. So just now to move to the statistics, and I think you probably heard most of them this morning, but just to refresh your memories. In the global context, this year, we're still talking overall about 168 million child labourers, down from the total we heard of 245,500,000. How does it break down and where are they? So looking at this report, and I hope you have had a chance to look at it, nearly 59% in agriculture, 25% in services, 7.2% in industry, nearly the same, 6.9% in domestic work, and just under 2% in not defined sectors. But the shocking figure for me, that leaves us with 98,000 children still working in the agricultural sector. 98 million children still working in the agricultural sector on our farms and plantations. I'm sure over the next 3 days you will see many photographs of child labourers, and I just wanted to show you some from the sectors that the IUF works in. This is a young Kyrgyz worker working in Kazakhstan, 12 years old, working in the tobacco sector. He's not the youngest worker. We also found this worker who told us he was 9 years old. And this is the accommodation where they, with their families, live in the field. Kyrgyz migrants go in huge numbers to work in the Kazakhstan's tobacco fields. We heard already from Kailash this morning about his visit to the Ivory Coast, and child labour in the cocoa sector has been well documented. And here you see rather, for me, very young children breaking and collecting the cocoa beans. Maybe a sector we haven't heard so much about is sugar. These are workers on a Kenyan sugar field. On this farm, we found 4 children between 10 and 12 years old working. And if you look at the young boy, you can see there that he's working with a machete. This, I think, is one of the sensitive issues for us. I'm often told, machetes are cultural, traditional, it's normal that children use them. But for me, it's also dangerous and causes many, many injuries. And I think one of the sad things sometimes is to actually look at the legs of these children and see the scars and wounds from use of machetes. I'm sure you all listened to the Director General of the ILO this morning when he presented the report, Making Progress Against Child Labour. And as the DG said, there was good news and bad news. The good news was, of course, the significant drop in numbers. But the bad news, and he did outline this, that even if this progress is maintained, we will not reach the target of elimination of all worst forms of child labour by 2016. And then actually looking through the report, there's more bad news. Even if we extend the deadline and look at reaching the goal of elimination 4 years later in 2020, we're still not going to achieve that. What we need to do is increase the annual rate of reduction from the current 6.5% to 24%. Those are the figures that the ILO is using. So for me, we require a substantial acceleration of efforts at all levels to work on this. But the question I want to put to you and to the rest of the panel is, where should we work to ensure that acceleration? Well, I think the report spells that out for us as well. It sets out clearly that agriculture, that 98 million, remains the biggest user of child labour. We've seen little change in the years on the percentage. In The Hague, we were talking about 60% of child labour being in agriculture, and the percentage has only dropped minimally since then. This, to me, indicates that we need a concerted, comprehensive, and accelerated approach specifically to tackling child labour in agriculture. But how do we do that? Well, some concrete suggestions for you. I'll say it now, and I'll come back to it in my conclusions, but I think we must leave this meeting with definite commitments, plans and timelines to end child labour in agriculture. Child labour takes place in industries, and we need to put at the top of the list calls for action on those sectors that are the biggest users of child labour. Governments, I think, should take the lead by making sure their minimum age legislation includes all types of agricultural holdings. One of the things that characterises the agricultural sector is very poor health and safety conditions. It ranks alongside mining and construction of one of the most dangerous industries to work in. So I think that one very concrete thing we could do is look at commitments to working on improving health and safety in agriculture. Safe working conditions are an absolutely integral part of social protection. And if a family loses an adult breadwinner to a fatal industrial accident in the agricultural sector, I think we will see there clearly that family plunge deeper into poverty and increased chances of children going to work to help to feed the family. Children below 18 years of age clearly should not be doing hazardous work. That's spelt out in the ILO conventions. However, putting in place good health and safety practices for adult workers would also mean that hazardous work for young people above the minimum age, so essentially 15 to 17-year-olds, would be transformed into decent youth employment. We should look at innovative solutions, like encouraging employers on large-scale farms to use their health and safety committees, which are usually required by law, to do outreach work, to work with local communities, especially their outgrowers or contract farmers, to improve health and safety, and to raise awareness on child labour. I think this will also help companies to ensure due diligence in their supply chains and compliance with the Ruggie framework and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It's an area that I don't have time to go into now, but I hope we can discuss those due diligence aspects later and also come back to it in tomorrow's supply chain discussion. So for me, improved health and safety in agriculture would help provide decent work for rural youth, which together with adequate education approaches is key to keeping young people in rural areas and working in agriculture. Again, governments can take the lead. And for me, one of those things that they should be doing is ratifying Convention 184 on safety and health in agriculture. And here I can also plug the ILO Code of Practice on safety and health in agriculture, which, for instance, give guidance on what can be done by employers, by workers and governments to work on some of these innovative outreach work on safety and health. I believe there is clear evidence that unionised workplaces are far less likely to have child labour, and I just briefly want to outline for you some of the work by our affiliates and by the IUF itself. One of the things, for instance, our Indian affiliates have been very involved in, and I know also working with NGOs in India, is in the campaign for the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. This brings employment to rural areas, and for me it has a dual advantage. It ensures rural people have work, but it also means they're less likely to be exploited by landowners. They have more bargaining power. They can say to the landowner, well, we get this much wage in the NREGA, so we're not going to work for you to less. So things like that have been one of the key priorities amongst our affiliates in India. Other unions have taken up specific commitments in collective bargaining, negotiating with employers, using social dialogue to create collective agreements that stipulate that the employer will not use child labour, and together with the union will work on the monitoring to ensure that takes place. And that's one of the things that has been achieved in the Ugandan tea sector. Other affiliates, like our affiliate in Ghana, have been working to organise self-employed workers to increase the outreach of unions away from the traditional formal sector to reach out to the more informal sector and to bring them into the union movement and to extend protection to them. Here in Brazil, and I'm pleased we have a representative from CONTAG in the audience, our affiliate here has been working to organize small farmers and working with them also around issues of land reform and land rights, which are crucial, I think, to ensuring the economic stability of small family farms. Other unions work very much on occupational health and safety, making it a priority to improve safety in the workplace. And other affiliates look at working with migrant workers. I showed you earlier the pictures of the workers in Kyrgyzstan, and there we have an agreement between the two unions, the Kyrgyz union and the Kazakhstan union, to work together. And one of the key things they do is work with local authorities to register the children of migrant workers so they have access to school. So very practical examples of engagement by trade unions in the agricultural sector. Okay. As the IUF, we also have some specific approaches based very much on dialogue and building representation in the industry. So we look at things like international framework agreements with some of the key companies in the agricultural sector and in the food sector, and work with them around ensuring that the ILO standards are applied in all of their workplaces. The only agreement we have at the moment in agriculture is with the banana company Chiquita. It's one of the biggest of the banana companies, and that agreement spells out clearly that Chiquita will not use child labor in its own plantations, and that it will also work to ensure that its suppliers have no child labor on their plantations. We also look at engaging the transnational companies in food processing on this issue, and we have regular dialogues with some of the key companies, Coca-Cola, Nestle, Unilever, about working conditions in the company and in their supply chain. The IUF is also a member of the partnership that was established in 2007 to bring together the UN agencies, the trade unions and the employers to work together. And we heard, I think in the morning, the importance of cooperation on eliminating child labor in agriculture. And very soon we will have launched a new website to pull together all of the information and the work that's been going on there. Just then, finally, to sum up, we've been working practically with the Global March, and you have the documentation from a conference we held jointly together in Washington last year, which set out a framework that we wanted to present here on a way forward for eliminating child labor in agriculture. One of the other key things that conference highlighted was the whole challenge of bringing small farmers into the discussion. We felt there that we were talking about them, but not with them. And I think that's one of the things we really need to discuss, how to reach out to small and family farms and bring them in to the discussion. Two more issues that I very quickly want to put on the table. Tomorrow we'll have the chance in the semi-plenary to talk about education, but you heard the very strong messages from Kailash this morning about the importance of education. And I think in rural areas there are real challenges. The quality of the schools is not there, very difficult to get teachers. And again, it's that putting together that whole package, decent schools, good working conditions for teachers. We can look at things like flexibility around harvest times. I've already checked this with our sister union, Education International. And as long as it doesn't interfere with the kids having access to the full curriculum, they think teachers can talk with communities about kids and what they do at harvest. There are also practical problems that we need to look at. How do we ensure the rights to education of those migrant kids that I was talking about earlier? Other practical issues. We know that pesticides are widely used in rural areas. We need to make sure that schools are also safe places and things like aerial spray drift don't go into schools. So, free compulsory education is crucial for eliminating child labour in agriculture, and we have to make sure that there is decent rural education. Finally, I can't finish without mentioning the P word. The employers in the room may be thinking I'm going to be talking about productivity, but it's not that, it's prices. So often I hear in multi-stakeholder meetings, oh, we can't talk about prices. It's not allowed under competition law, whatever, but they are at the heart of the problem. Small farmers at the bottom of the supply chain often don't have sufficient bargaining power to ensure fair prices for their crops. Agricultural workers, too often denied the right to join a union and be represented by a union through collective bargaining, have the least power in supply chains. We need to look much more systematically at how to achieve a fairer distribution of value in supply chains to ensure decent livelihoods for small farmers and living wages for agricultural workers. Child labour in agriculture is clearly linked to rural poverty, and this is one of the root causes that must be tackled. So in conclusion, I think we need a new approach to agriculture that places the right to food and decent work in agriculture at its centre, an agriculture that does not rely on child labour but has a skilled, trained and fairly remunerated workforce. And we need governments to extend labour legislation and minimum age legislation to agriculture. And as I said in the opening, we must leave this meeting with definite commitments, plans and timetables to end child labour in agriculture. Thank you.
It is so difficult for the panelists when they were told they had 20 minutes and now I take them down to 15. But I intend to try to keep the timeline and therefore there will be no opening for questions now. We will have to come back to that later. So I just go on and I really have some questions myself about how to reach out to the smallholders.